She never chased, never barked, never begged for the handouts others offered her. Her paws carried the weight of stories untold, of fires survived, of hands once held, of faces long gone. The world called her a stray, but she was never lost. She carried a map written not in streets, but in wounds left behind by others. Wherever grief was too heavy, she arrived like steady breath beneath breaking hearts. She wasn't looking for home, she was leading others back to theirs. Emily couldn't yet know that the broken lighthouse would shine again not for ships, but for her broken heart. Roy had no idea that the tackle box held his wife's voice buried beneath years of silent grief. Frank certainly could not even realize that Sable's bark would wake him seconds before the cabin's silent gas filled his lungs. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy heartfelt tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come. Now, let's begin. It all started with the kind of silence that doesn't knock, doesn't shout, doesn't even whisper. It simply settles around a person like fog rolling across forgotten hills, swallowing everything they once dared to hope for. The morning sun crawled slowly over the rooftops of Redwood Point, stretching its long fingers across empty porches, faded curtains, and cracked sidewalks that carried the soft weight of years gone by. This town had grown old like its people, not through sudden collapse, but by the slow and patient erosion that comes when children leave, stores close, and conversations shrink into hollow routines repeated more from habit than from joy. At the end of Harrison Street, in a white house with green shutters that hadn't seen fresh paint since Reagan was still a new name in politics, sat Martha Greaves, 82 years old and shrinking into herself a little more with every sunrise. Her thin hands rested on the kitchen table, fingers tracing circles on the chipped porcelain saucer beneath a cup of coffee that had long since cooled, but which she continued to stir as if still negotiating some forgotten bargain with time itself. The clock above the stove ticked steadily, the same way it had for decades, though its sound now seemed louder in the absence of conversation. For 20 years, Martha had lived alone inside that house, with no one left to fill its rooms except the carefully preserved echoes of her daughter's laughter, trapped like perfume sealed inside a glass bottle. Her daughter, Eliza, had been her pride, her joy, the seamstress who once dreamed of opening her own bridal shop, whose fingers could make lace sing, whose eyes sparkled with every new creation that hung carefully on padded hangers in the sewing room upstairs. But Eliza never opened that shop. One winter evening, driving home with her fiancé after selecting the final fabric for her own wedding gown, a patch of black ice turned the world upside down in the space of a heartbeat. Since that night, the door to Eliza's sewing room had remained locked. Martha couldn't bear to open it, couldn't bear to see the unfinished dress, the scattered spools of thread, the half-written guest list sitting beside a cup of tea that never had a chance to cool. And so, life became a steady rhythm of locked doors, unopened letters, and coffee poured for one. Until, one morning, the dog appeared. Martha first noticed her sitting beneath the old maple tree in the front yard, tall, poised, with ears perked like a soldier on watch, her fur glinting like polished sand beneath the pale morning light. There was something ancient in the way the German shepherd sat, not lost, not desperate, but as though she had simply arrived precisely where she was meant to be, and long before Martha could wonder why. The tag on her collar was worn smooth from years of wear, but Martha could barely make out the faint engraving. Belonged to James Holloway, if found, return. James Holloway, the name meant nothing to Martha, but somehow, the dog's presence felt heavier than coincidence. For several days, the shepherd, whom Martha, without deciding, began to call Luna, remained stationed beneath that tree, neither approaching nor retreating. Simply watching the house with eyes that seemed to hold the kind of patience only animals and very old souls are capable of carrying. At first, Martha resisted even stepping onto the porch, unsure of what it meant to acknowledge the creature's arrival. But slowly, as the days drifted like leaves on a still river, her curiosity outweighed her hesitation. One morning, she placed a bowl of water by the porch steps. Luna approached, not eagerly, but respectfully, as though honoring Martha's space, allowing her to set the terms of this silent companionship. Her large, amber eyes met Martha's with a steadiness that sent an unexpected warmth into the old woman's chest, one she hadn't felt since before the house grew so terribly quiet. Day after day, their rhythm settled, Martha on the porch swing with her untouched coffee, Luna lying nearby in the shade, her breathing slow and steady, like the ticking clock in the kitchen. And though no words were exchanged, something began to shift in the space between them, not quickly, but undeniably. Then came the storm. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows and wind clawed at the shutters, a branch cracked loose from the maple, crashing against the side of the house with a thunderous snap. The force shook the foundation enough that one upstairs door, a door unopened for 20 years, slipped from its latch. The following morning, Martha ascended the staircase, her legs unsteady as the scent of lavender sachets and time-worn fabric crept beneath the gap in the doorway. The sewing room door now stood ajar. Her heart pounded, her breath shallow as tears threatened, but behind her, Luna pressed her head gently against Martha's hip, not pushing, merely steadying. With trembling fingers, Martha pushed the door open. Inside, sunlight filtered through the thin lace curtains, illuminating bolts of untouched fabric, delicate lace draped over a mannequin, and the unfinished wedding gown that still waited on the dress form. Its satin bodice glowing softly like the memory of a daughter frozen in time. On the work table sat a small wooden box, one Martha did not recognize, a box that hadn't been there the last time the room was alive with Eliza's humming. Hand shaking, she opened the box to reveal a collection of handwritten notes, messages from Eliza, words never spoken aloud, confessions, hopes, apologies, and finally, a sealed letter addressed simply, for Mom. Martha collapsed onto the nearby chair, pressing the letter to her chest as silent tears soaked the paper, knowing she had been led here, not by chance, but by something or someone who understood what she was too afraid to face alone. As the clock ticked softly downstairs, Luna lay beside her, resting her head upon Martha's slipper, steady as always. Hours passed, until finally, through a voice thick with tears but full of fragile wonder, Martha whispered, "Do you think she sent you here, Eliza, or did you already know your way? I believe sometimes we carry messages others are too afraid to deliver," Albert Connors whispered, his voice gravelly, weathered from years of unspoken words, as his hand rested on the rusted gas tank of a motorcycle that had not roared to life in decades. The morning air in Brookhaven was heavy with the scent of damp leaves and motor oil, blending with the faint sweetness of nearby apple trees now bending beneath the weight of late autumn fruit. The workshop stood at the far end of his overgrown backyard, its once proud white siding now blistered and peeling, giving way to patches of gray beneath like an old man's scalp surrendering to time. Albert had not stepped inside this place in almost 15 years. The heavy wooden doors, once swung open daily to welcome neighbors needing repairs, had long since stiffened in their hinges like arthritic joints too stubborn to move. Vines crept across the roofline like green fingers pulling the structure into the earth, while broken panes in the small windows allowed just enough light to make out the silhouettes of tools that had not felt his touch since the day everything fell apart. Albert Connors had once been known as the best mechanic in 3 counties, a man whose hands could listen to engines as if they spoke directly to him, whose eyes could read the pulse of a machine simply by watching the exhaust. He taught his son, Danny, everything he knew, passing on not just skill, but the quiet pride that comes from fixing what others deem beyond repair. But the accident took Danny long before his time, a wet road, a blind curve, a night where youth moved too fast for wisdom to catch up. The very motorcycle that stood before Albert now had once been Danny's pride, a 1973 Triumph Bonneville, midnight blue, chrome shining like glass the day they wheeled it home together. After the funeral, Albert locked the shop. The tools went cold. The bike gathered dust. And in the silence that followed, grief hardened inside him like cooling metal, impossible to bend, impossible to break. Until the dog came. He noticed her first from the kitchen window, sitting quietly near the sagging garden fence, her fur catching the pale morning sun like liquid gold trapped beneath soft waves of sand. Her eyes met his with a steadiness that stirred something inside his chest, not panic, not confusion, but an unsettling familiarity, as though she already knew him, or perhaps knew why she was there. Day after day, she returned to that same spot beneath the elm tree, waiting without expectation, watching without judgment. Albert resisted at first. He told himself it was just a stray, though he could not explain why no one in town seemed to claim her, or why she never ventured to beg for food or attention. But with each sunrise, her presence became less of a mystery and more of a quiet invitation. And so, one morning, he opened the back door. The dog, whom Albert now found himself calling Luna, though he could not recall when the name first crossed his mind, walked toward him without hesitation, pausing just a few feet away, offering neither demand nor submission, simply companionship. There was no leash, no collar commanding her stay, but she remained by his side, as though anchored not by rope, but by something older, a tether of understanding forged long before their paths had crossed. It was Luna who led him back to the workshop. As Albert sat beneath the old maple, staring into his black coffee, she rose from her place and padded slowly toward the forgotten doors, pausing briefly to glance back at him, as if gently suggesting what he already feared was inevitable. Her gaze said nothing aloud, but it whispered the question his heart had long buried. "Are you ready?" His hands trembled as he approached the doors, the hinges groaning in protest as he forced them open. Dust particles swirled in shafts of morning light, like tiny spirits long trapped inside the stale air, dancing now in sudden freedom. The motorcycle stood exactly as he had left it, the same oil stains beneath the wheels, the same wrench still resting where Danny had last placed it on the bench. Albert's knees threatened to buckle beneath the weight of memory, but Luna pressed against his leg with a gentle firmness, grounding him like a steady hand on a friend's shoulder. Drawing a breath deeper than any he had dared take in years, he reached out, his fingers brushing across the cool, dust-laden metal of the Triumph's gas tank. "All right, girl," he whispered, his voice cracking under the strain of old wounds reopening softly. "Let's see if I still remember how to listen." The hours slipped away unnoticed as his hands found familiar rhythms, draining old fuel, cleaning clogged carburetors, adjusting cables stiff from years of neglect. Though his joints ached and his eyes blurred, Albert felt his son's presence in every turn of the wrench, in every hum of tools returning to life. Luna remained beside him throughout, watching, waiting, breathing in time with the steady rise and fall of a man slowly piecing himself back together. As dusk settled, Albert twisted the ignition. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared awake, its voice deep and smooth, vibrating through the floorboards like a heart restarting after too long in silence. The Triumph lived again, and with it, something inside Albert stirred free. That evening, as he and Luna sat beneath the amber glow of the porch light, neighbors paused to admire the gleaming machine now resting proudly in the driveway. One young boy, Tyler, approached shyly, eyes wide with wonder, his hands tracing invisible lines in the air as he imagined himself astride the machine. "You used to build bikes like this?" Tyler asked, his voice full of cautious awe. Albert smiled softly, glancing toward Luna, who now lay peacefully at his feet. "I did, son," he replied, his voice warmer than it had been in years. "And maybe I still can." The next morning, as Tyler returned, eyes full of questions and hope, Albert's voice carried softly as they stepped toward the workshop. "Do you think she knew to find me, or did she come for someone else?" "I believe she follows hearts that don't yet know their calling," whispered Isabel Matthews, her young voice trembling against the wind as she sat at the very edge of the old pier in Silverport. The morning fog clung thick to the shoreline, curling through the air like quiet fingers trying to pull her backward, but she kept her gaze fixed on the endless gray sheet of water before her. The lake stretched wide and still, offering no answers, no hints of the secrets it carried beneath its glassy surface, only its silent, endless waiting. Isabel had been coming to this place every morning for the last 4 summers, always sitting on the same worn plank where her mother used to sit beside her before she disappeared into the cold grip of those distant waves. The town had grown used to whispering about the Matthews girl, the one whose mother vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a small rowboat that had washed ashore 3 days later, empty and silent. No note, no witness, no evidence, just the endless ache of unanswered questions that had carved themselves into Isabel's chest like roots twisting deep into stone. She was only 9 when her mother disappeared. Now, at 13, she carried the weight of those missing years like an old woman wears the stiffness in her bones, not visible to the eye, but always heavy beneath every step. Her father, once a strong man with wide shoulders and a voice that could fill a room with laughter, had grown small and quiet, folding in on himself with every year that passed without word of his wife's fate. The lake had given them nothing, and yet Isabel returned each morning, as if some part of her still believed the water held more than its silence. It was on one such morning that Luna arrived. At first, Isabel thought she was imagining the silhouette moving through the fog, tall, steady, deliberate, like a sentinel emerging from forgotten dreams. The German shepherd came not like a stray looking for food, but like a messenger who had been traveling a very long way to find this precise moment. Without hesitation, Luna padded to the end of the pier, sitting beside the girl without a sound, her breath visible in the cool morning air, synchronized with Isabel's shallow, uneven breathing. There was something oddly comforting about the way Luna simply sat, not demanding, not comforting in the way adults often tried and failed to be, but offering the kind of quiet presence that allowed grief to exhale slowly, without fear of judgment. For several days, the pair met like this. The girl with her thoughts and the dog with her silence, both staring into the unyielding face of the water that neither forgave nor confessed. Then came the storm. One night, the wind howled like voices finally given permission to scream, tearing at the fragile dock and hurling waves against the pilings with a fury not seen in years. Isabel watched from her bedroom window as lightning carved jagged scars into the sky, and rain hammered the world like angry fists pounding on a locked door. By morning, when the storm had exhausted itself and the sky hung heavy with apology, Isabel ran down to the pier. She feared what she might find, that the planks had surrendered to the lake's hunger, that the last place she still shared with her mother might finally be gone. But the dock, though battered and broken in places, still stood. And floating gently in the tangle of reeds near the shore, something glinted beneath the thin layer of water. Luna reached it first, stepping into the shallows with careful confidence, her teeth gently pulling free a battered piece of driftwood entangled with an old fishing net. From within that sodden bundle, a small waterproof pouch slipped loose, bobbing in the water like a message in a bottle finally returned from exile. Isabel waded in, her hands trembling as she reached for the pouch, her fingers numb both from cold and from something far deeper, the unspoken hope that after all these years, the lake was finally ready to speak. Inside was a folded letter, its paper softened by moisture but still intact, the handwriting unmistakable even after all this time. To my darling Isabel, if this ever reaches you. Her breath caught, her legs buckled, but Luna pressed against her side, steadying the girl with the same quiet strength she had offered to so many before. With careful hands, Isabel unfolded the pages and read her mother's words. I didn't leave you by choice, my love. The boat overturned that morning, and I was carried far beyond where I thought anyone would ever find me. When they pulled me aboard that passing vessel, my mind was not my own for many months. They told me I was lost, but I never forgot your face. I have tried for years to find my way back, but everything that could go wrong has. If you find this, know that I never gave up. I will always be trying to come home. Isabel sank to her knees in the shallow water, clutching the letter to her chest as the weight of years she had carried alone finally split open, releasing sobs that racked her small body like aftershocks of an earthquake too long suppressed. Luna stayed beside her, unflinching, allowing the girl's tears to soak into her fur without moving away. Later that evening, Isabel sat beside her father on the porch, her head resting against his arm, the letter now dry and carefully tucked inside her jacket. The man who had not wept since his wife vanished now wept freely, his tears falling into Isabel's hair as he whispered apologies that no longer needed to be spoken. As the stars blinked awake above them, Isabel glanced toward Luna, who lay nearby beneath the porch light. In a voice soft but steady, she asked the question that had grown inside her chest. Do you think she always knew where to find me, or did something bring her here? I believe she listens to the echoes of unfinished goodbyes, whispered Harvey Collins, his trembling fingers hovering over the chipped wooden body of the guitar resting across his lap. The morning sunlight streamed through the high, arched windows of the Harbor Field Community Hall, its golden beams slicing through the floating dust that danced like quiet ghosts in the still air. The old music hall, once alive with the laughter and harmony of choirs, bands, and holiday gatherings, now sat in silence, a cathedral for memories that had grown too heavy to carry. Harvey had not stepped onto this stage in nearly 17 years. The once proud wooden floor beneath him now creaked beneath his weight, like an old friend unsure whether to welcome or warn him. The faded burgundy curtains, drawn back but forgotten, swayed gently in the faint draft sneaking through a broken window pane, offering a soft, rhythmic breath that mimicked the pulse of the room itself. Once, this had been Harvey's sanctuary, a place where his fingers translated sorrow into melody, where his voice once lifted others from their burdens, even as he quietly battled his own beneath the surface. He had taught children to sing, guided hesitant fingers across piano keys, and tuned countless guitars for students who looked to him with bright, eager eyes. Among them had been his grandson, Samuel, whose talent bloomed early and burned bright, too bright, perhaps, for this fragile world. But talent alone was never protection. A wrong place, a wrong time, a car accident on a rain-slicked road, and suddenly, Samuel's voice, like so many others Harvey had nurtured, was silenced forever. The grief swallowed Harvey whole. The guitar strings grew brittle from neglect, The piano keys stiffened from disuse, and the community hall's once lively gatherings dwindled without his steady hand guiding them forward. The town respected his sorrow, stepping back quietly, waiting for him to return when he was ready, but he never did. Until Luna came. The dog arrived not through the front doors, but as though conjured by the very building itself, appearing quietly in the center aisle one morning, her fur shimmering beneath the shafts of light as though dipped in the morning sun. Her gaze fixed on Harvey with that familiar, patient stillness, the same unspoken invitation she had extended to others before him. She carried no urgency, no desperation, only the kind of steady presence that allows broken souls the time to choose whether or not to face what they've buried. For several mornings, Harvey sat in the audience seats, staring at the empty stage while Luna lay quietly nearby, her breathing slow and measured, grounding him as he wrestled with memories that pressed against his ribs like unshed tears. The air inside the hall grew lighter with each passing day, as though the building itself exhaled each time Harvey did. And then, one morning, without fully understanding why, Harvey rose from his seat and ascended the steps to the stage. His knees protested, his back stiffened beneath the strain of years, but his hands found their way across the old guitar resting on the chair, Samuel's guitar, left behind on the last day they played together. The strings, though dusty, still held tune surprisingly well, as if they too had been waiting for this moment. Harvey closed his eyes, letting his fingers remember what his mind had tried to forget. He strummed softly, the first few chords hesitant, like a voice learning to speak again after a long silence. The notes drifted upward, filling the vaulted ceiling, blending with the faint creaks and groans of the old building, a duet between man and place. Both were learning how to breathe. As the music flowed, tears slipped freely down Harvey's cheeks, not as sharp daggers of pain, but as warm rivers of release, washing away the layers of hardened grief he had carried like armor. Luna rose and walked to the front of the stage, sitting squarely beneath the spotlight as if bearing silent witness to a moment long overdue. Hours passed unnoticed as Harvey played old songs, new melodies, half-remembered lullabies, each note carrying away a piece of the sorrow he had clutched too tightly for too long. Later that week, word quietly spread through town that Mr. Collins had reopened the music hall. Children arrived first, curious, wide-eyed, eager, their laughter filling the space with a warmth not felt in years. Parents followed, some with hesitant steps, others with full hearts, drawn by the sound of life returning to the place where many of their own childhoods had once been shaped. Harvey stood among them, his hands guiding small fingers across guitar frets, offering gentle encouragement as voices rose once more in song. The music hall was breathing again, alive beneath the golden light of late autumn afternoons. That evening, as Harvey locked the doors and Luna settled beside him beneath the porch lamp, his voice broke the quiet night air with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. Do you think she carries the weight of every sorrow she helps mend? Or does she leave a piece of it behind with us? I believe she carries only what hearts aren't ready to let go of yet, Frank Dalton whispered, his voice barely audible over the soft hum of wind brushing through the towering pines that circled his solitary cabin atop the ridgeline of Elkridge. The mountains stretched like great sleeping giants beneath him, their peaks softened by thin clouds, their slopes blanketed in silent rows of evergreens that had watched over him for longer than most men could comprehend. Here, the world spoke in quiet languages, the distant call of a hawk, the gentle cracking of old branches swaying beneath years of patience, and the steady beat of his own breath, which now served as both company and conversation. Frank had lived in this Firewatch cabin for nearly a decade, long after the state budget had officially closed the station and long after his wife, Clara, had lost her battle to a sickness neither of them had truly understood. The forest had become both his sanctuary and his penance, a place where he convinced himself that solitude was safer than facing a world that kept moving forward while he remained trapped inside the same brittle moment. He told himself he stayed to keep watch for fires, to protect the valley below, but truthfully, he remained because it was easier to guard trees than to risk losing people again. Every morning, Frank climbed the narrow stairs of the tower, scanning the horizon for smoke, even though no one else waited for his reports. Every evening, he descended those same steps, boiling his simple meals and listening to the lonely creaks of a cabin too familiar with silence. The radio had long since fallen quiet. The last transmission received was 7 years ago, a mechanical farewell from a world no longer listening. But Luna had arrived before sunrise. Frank first spotted her silhouette standing near the edge of the tree line, her golden coat catching the pale glow of dawn as if wrapped in morning itself. Unlike deer or bears who kept their distance, the German shepherd stood perfectly still, her posture both respectful and unflinching, as though she had walked 1,000 miles with one singular purpose and had now found what she was looking for. Her eyes, calm and steady, met his without flinching, two old souls recognizing the weight the other carried. Frank called to her softly, unsure if his voice would be enough to reach her or whether she would vanish into the woods like a ghost disturbed. But instead, Luna walked forward, each deliberate step echoing like a silent agreement between strangers who already understood too much about loss. He offered her water and food, not out of obligation, but as one lonely creature might to another who's simply grown tired of wandering. She accepted the offerings with grace, but what struck Frank most was how she remained, not begging, not restless, simply there. That night, the temperature dropped unexpectedly. A storm, rolling down from higher peaks, coiled itself around the mountain with icy fingers that rattled window frames and whistled through cracks in the walls like spirits searching for an open door. Frank stoked the fire, but deep down, he feared whether the old gas line feeding his tiny stove would hold through another winter. He awoke hours later to the faint, acrid scent of gas. The hiss was subtle but undeniable, a slow leak snaking its invisible danger through the small cabin. And then, without warning, Luna leapt onto his cot, her paws pressing firmly into his chest, her weight and sharp bark snapping him awake just as the first dizzying wave of nausea hit him. Disoriented, but driven by instinct, Frank stumbled toward the front door, Luna guiding him with calculated nudges, her movements fierce yet controlled, as though she had rehearsed this moment many times before. The cold night air slapped him awake fully as they burst outside into the open, where stars glittered above like silent witnesses. Within moments, a faint humph sounded from inside, not an explosion, but enough to ignite a small flame that licked hungrily beneath the cabin's old wooden floorboards. Frank fell to his knees, breathless not from smoke but from the realization that, without Luna, his story might have ended beneath those collapsing rafters before morning arrived. Together, they sat beneath the towering pines, watching as the fire consumed the cabin, not in fury, but in slow, almost ceremonial fashion, as if releasing decades of unshed grief into the sky above. He did not weep, not yet, but felt a strange weight lift from his shoulders as though the forest itself had exhaled alongside him. Days later, when townsfolk arrived, drawn by the distant glow, they found Frank safe and unbroken, and beside him, the calm German shepherd whose quiet vigilance had rewritten what was meant to be his final chapter. In the weeks that followed, Frank chose not to retreat back into the isolation he once called safety. Instead, he moved into town, reopening the old forestry center, offering classes for young hikers, campers, and scouts, teaching them not just about trees and fires, but about how life itself could burn you down if you didn't learn to rebuild. That evening, as the sunset painted the valley with streaks of amber and rose, Frank sat on the porch of his modest new cabin, watching Luna rest at his feet, her breathing steady and content. With a voice heavy from reflection, he asked the question that had stirred in his heart since that night. Do you think she always arrives in time, or is it that time bends itself around her? I believe she finds those who've wandered too far from their voices, Sophie Daniels thought, though no words came from her lips, for speaking had long since abandoned her. The air inside the forgotten greenhouse of Maplewood was thick with the scent of damp soil and overgrown vines, a place that once brimmed with color but now lay wrapped in shadows and silence, mirroring the girl who had made it her refuge. Sunbeams pierced through cracked glass panes, illuminating pockets of green fighting to survive beneath years of neglect, while the ivy clung stubbornly to every beam as if refusing to surrender to time's quiet erosion. Sophie had been just 8 years old when the accident took her father, a man whose laughter had filled rooms like music, whose hands had guided hers through rows of soil, teaching her the names of every flower, every creeping vine, every blooming secret the earth had to offer. His absence had stolen not only her smile but the very words from her mouth, as if grief itself had reached into her throat and locked her voice inside a chamber too dark for sound to escape. The doctors called it trauma-induced mutism, but labels offered little comfort to a mother already drowning in her own quiet sorrow. For years, Sophie had come here, to the greenhouse her father once tended with tender devotion, seeking shelter not from storms outside, but from the ones that raged inside her fragile chest. The town passed by her with cautious smiles and lowered eyes, unsure how to comfort a girl who wouldn't, or couldn't, speak back. Even her mother, Grace, despite every whispered bedtime story and every warm embrace, could not coax a single word from her since that terrible day. Then came Luna. The German shepherd arrived without fanfare, slipping through the broken door one late afternoon as the autumn light stretched long fingers across the dirt-streaked floor. Her approach was slow, deliberate, as if sensing the delicate threads holding Sophie together might snap under the weight of any sudden movement. Luna paused several feet away, lowering her body to the cool ground, resting her head gently upon her paws, offering not words but presence, the kind of silent companionship that speaks directly to the place where grief has built its strongest walls. For many days that followed, they shared the greenhouse in quiet partnership, Sophie sitting cross-legged in her corner, sketching flowers from memory into a worn notebook, and Luna watching over her with unblinking, patient eyes that held no expectation, only understanding. Each time Sophie's breath grew shallow under the weight of rising panic, Luna would inch closer, her warmth anchoring the girl back to the safety of the present. Then one morning, as the first frost painted the glass panes with delicate veins of ice, something shifted. A small robin, likely confused by the sudden chill, had found its way into the greenhouse, fluttering wildly against the glass, its tiny wings slapping frantically as it searched for escape. The sharp sound startled Sophie, her heartbeat rising as fear gripped her chest, not from the bird itself, but from the piercing break in the fragile stillness she so desperately clung to. The robin's panic mirrored her own, its rapid movements stirring leaves into a frantic dance, creating chaos where peace once settled. Sophie's eyes welled as she hugged her knees tightly, rocking gently as the familiar waves of panic threatened to pull her under once more. And then, Luna moved. With steady grace, the shepherd rose and approached the trapped bird, her movement slow, her posture low, like a shepherd guiding a frightened lamb rather than a hunter stalking prey. Luna positioned herself between the robin and the girl, her eyes never leaving Sophie's as if to say, "I am here. You are safe." Within moments, the robin found an opening, a small crack where a pane of glass had long since fallen, and slipped out into the open sky, vanishing into the cold morning air. Sophie exhaled, her trembling body slowly unfurling from its tight cocoon. For a long moment, silence returned, not heavy like before, but lighter, as though something trapped inside her had shifted, loosened, found room to breathe. And then, with a voice dry and fragile from years of disuse, she whispered her first word since her father's death. Home. The single word hung in the air like the opening chord of a long-forgotten song, simple yet profound, trembling yet certain. Luna remained beside her, tail gently thumping against the dirt floor, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement that the first stone had been lifted from the heavy wall. News traveled quickly through Maplewood, of the girl who had finally spoken, of the dog who stayed. Grace wept openly the first time Sophie looked into her eyes and whispered "Mama," a word once stolen but now returned like spring after a brutal winter. In the weeks that followed, the greenhouse came alive again, windows repaired, soil tilled, fresh seedlings planted, a small army of neighbors and friends joining hands around mother and daughter as laughter once again filled the space where silence had ruled. That evening, as the sun dipped beneath the hills and stars blinked softly into the vast velvet sky, Sophie sat on the newly repaired bench, Luna resting beside her, their breathing calm and steady. With a voice still small, but no longer afraid, Sophie asked the question that lingered inside her heart. "Do you think she always knows when we're ready, or does she help us get ready?" "I believe she arrives just before the soul collapses completely," Margaret Pearson whispered, her voice carrying the fragile weight of years spent balancing between silent endurance and unbearable emptiness, as she sat beneath the slanted beams of the old attic in Riverbend. The fading daylight filtered through a narrow, dust-covered window, casting pale golden lines across the room like the soft remnants of hope struggling to survive in a place long forgotten by time. Stacks of old boxes, covered in moth-eaten cloths and brittle newspaper, surrounded her like monuments to memories carefully packed away but never truly buried. The attic had remained untouched for nearly 15 years, ever since that terrible evening when fate had stolen what neither Margaret nor her husband, Thomas, could ever reclaim. Their son, Andrew, once full of wild dreams and fearless laughter, had died on a rain-slick highway. A single curve, a single second, and with him vanished the light that once filled this home. In the wake of Andrew's absence, their marriage had become a quiet truce. Two grieving souls existing beneath the same roof, speaking only in necessities, their hearts encased in protective shells too delicate to risk further shattering. Margaret stopped sewing. Thomas stopped his woodworking. The house grew quieter with every passing season, each room filled with unspoken words that hovered like thin fog no breeze could carry away. And so the attic remained locked, not because either of them declared it so, but because neither dared to face the echoes sealed inside. Until Luna came. The shepherd arrived one gray morning, her approach steady and calm as though she had followed a map known only to creatures who walk between grief and grace. She stood before the house, beneath the creaking willow tree, her golden coat shimmering softly beneath the low, somber clouds, as though nature itself had wrapped her in a gentle embrace. Margaret watched from the kitchen window, her hand resting against the cool glass, feeling the familiar pressure inside her chest. Not fear, but a strange recognition, as if this dog had not stumbled here by chance. At first, Margaret did nothing. But with each passing day, Luna returned, sitting patiently beneath the willow, neither begging nor seeking attention, merely waiting, as if sensing that time was not her enemy. Finally, on the 5th morning, as Thomas sat silent over his untouched coffee, Margaret opened the door. Luna rose and walked slowly to the porch, pausing just shy of the threshold, her eyes meeting Margaret's with a depth that spoke not of animals, but of something older, something knowing. With a slight nod, as though accepting an unspoken invitation, Luna stepped inside. The house felt different with her presence. Not brighter, not louder, but somehow less heavy, as if her very breathing helped carry the invisible burdens that had weighed the rooms down for so many years. That evening, Luna stood at the base of the narrow attic stairs, her gaze fixed upward, her posture calm but insistent. Margaret's breath caught as she followed the shepherd's eyes, feeling her pulse quicken with dread and curiosity entwined. Thomas, watching from the living room, whispered softly without meeting her gaze. "Maybe it's time." With a courage she could not fully explain, Margaret ascended the staircase, her hand gripping the rail as each step creaked beneath her hesitant weight. Luna followed, her paws making barely a sound, her steady presence granting Margaret a strange sense of safety as they reached the locked attic door. The key, still hanging on its old hook nearby, slid easily into the rusted lock, and with a click that sounded both terrifying and freeing, the door swung open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and faded paper. Old toys, books, and photographs lay stacked with careful precision, relics of a life once bursting with color and noise. And on top of an antique trunk, resting alone, was a weathered leather-bound journal. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the diary, recognizing Andrew's handwriting immediately, the looping letters of a young man who once filled pages with everything his lips had left unsaid. The first page contained a note, written just weeks before his accident. "Mom and Dad, if you ever find this, I hope you'll know how much I loved you both. I know you tried to protect me from my choices, but I had to find my own way. I never blamed you. I only ever wanted you to be proud." Margaret's breath broke, her tears falling freely onto the fragile pages, each drop a release of years spent locked inside an armor of quiet despair. Luna sat beside her, leaning gently against Margaret's leg, her warmth steadying the quiver in Margaret's body. Hours later, as the evening sun dipped beneath the tree line, Margaret and Thomas sat side by side in the living room, the diary now resting between them on the coffee table. For the first time in years, they held hands, their fingers intertwining as though rediscovering a language long abandoned. Thomas spoke first, his voice raw but filled with something that almost sounded like peace. "He was never angry with us," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of unspoken guilt finally being lifted. Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening with the same fragile hope. And as the weight inside their home lightened, Luna curled beneath their feet, content. Later that night, as the stars blinked softly into existence, Margaret glanced toward Luna, her voice softer than the breeze outside. "Do you think she's carrying their words back to him, or simply bringing his words home to us?" "I believe she carries pieces of both," whispered Dorothy Flynn, her words trailing off like a breath caught in the throat of memory, as she stood beneath the hollow dome of the abandoned lighthouse in Summit Hollow. The wind pressed against the weathered stone, humming through narrow cracks like a distant choir of ghosts, their songs blending with the rhythmic crashing of waves that had battered the shoreline long before Dorothy was born. Time had not been kind to this place. Paint peeled from rusting railings, wooden stairs groaned beneath even the lightest steps, and broken panes rattled whenever the ocean exhaled its salty breath against the leaning tower. Dorothy's hands, gnarled from age and years of hard living, rested on the iron railing that once guided sailors home through countless storms. Her late husband, Walter Flynn, had been the last keeper of this lighthouse, a man who believed that even when the sea raged and the skies blackened, a single light could mean the difference between life and oblivion. Walter was a quiet man, steady as stone, who carried his duty not as obligation but as sacred responsibility until the night the storm came. It had been a storm unlike any other. The sky fractured beneath relentless lightning, the waves climbed higher than memory dared recall, and Walter, refusing to abandon his post, had climbed the very stairs where Dorothy now stood, intent on keeping the light burning for any ship lost in the chaos. But the wind was merciless. The final lightning strike shattered the main lantern, and Walter, struck by debris, fell, his body swallowed by the sea that had once bowed to his watchful eye. The lighthouse was closed soon after, left to rot as newer technologies rendered it obsolete, and Dorothy, left without husband or purpose, retreated into herself like a hermit crab abandoning the shoreline of the living. The town whispered her name with pity, but kept their distance, unsure how to comfort a woman whose grief had calcified into a second skin. For years, Dorothy returned here only in dreams. Until Luna came. The shepherd appeared not in town, but right here, at the foot of the lighthouse steps, her golden coat glistening beneath the morning mist, as if sculpted from sunlight itself. Dorothy had arrived that day to leave fresh flowers along the rusted gate, a ritual she performed each year on the anniversary of Walter's passing. She hadn't expected company, especially not from a creature whose eyes held the depth of something far older than mere instinct. Luna made no sound, offered no approach. She simply sat, as though her presence alone was invitation enough. For several mornings, Dorothy found herself returning. And each time, Luna was there steady, patient, never pressing, allowing Dorothy's guard to lower piece by brittle piece. Finally, one morning, as gulls circled in lazy arcs above and the waves spoke their endless language below, Dorothy stepped through the gate and approached the tower's door, a door she hadn't dared open since the night everything changed. Luna followed, her paws making soft echoes against the worn stone steps, her breathing calm and rhythmic, offering silent companionship as Dorothy's heart pounded against her ribs. Inside, the air smelled of salt and rust, tinged faintly with the scent of old oil and rotting rope, the fragrances of Walter's old world, still lingering like faint whispers. The stairs climbed endlessly upward, each creaking step a fragile bridge connecting Dorothy to a part of herself long sealed away. At the very top, beneath the broken lantern, Dorothy paused. The fractured glass reflected the pale gray sky, while beneath her feet lay the maintenance hatch Walter used for emergency repairs. Something caught her eye. Wedged beneath the hatch door was a small, weathered bundle wrapped in oilcloth. With trembling hands, she freed the package and gently peeled away the stiff, salt-stained fabric. Inside lay Walter's old logbook, its cover cracked but intact, the pages within remarkably preserved. The final entry, written in his familiar, steady hand, greeted her like a letter delivered across time itself. If you find this, my love, know that I never feared the sea. My greatest fear was leaving you behind. But if this light fails tonight, I pray you will forgive me for not being able to come home. Dorothy's tears came not as sharp daggers but as soft, steady rivers, a release of years spent clenching against a pain too vast to name. Luna pressed gently against her leg, grounding her to the present even as grief flowed freely through the crack now opened within her. For hours, Dorothy sat there, reading page after page, each entry a quiet conversation, each sentence a thread stitching her back to the man she once lost but never truly left. In the weeks that followed, Dorothy made a decision neither the town nor even she expected. With town support, volunteers, and fresh funding, Dorothy led the restoration of the lighthouse not as a functioning beacon for sailors, but as a memorial for those who had loved and lost along the merciless coast. The lantern was repaired, not to guide ships, but to shine each evening as a quiet reminder that some lights, even when broken, can still burn with purpose. On the night the beacon was reignited for the first time in nearly 20 years, Dorothy stood beneath the glowing dome, her hand resting upon Luna's back. As the beam swept slowly across the waves, Dorothy whispered into the wind, her voice carrying both wonder and peace. Do you think she carries these lights forward, or simply helps us reignite what we believed was gone forever? I believe she gathers what's been left behind too long in silence, murmured Earl Simmons, his voice weathered like the cracked leather of his flight log, as he stood alone inside the silent control tower of Stonebridge Airfield. Outside, the horizon stretched endlessly, where the once busy runways now lay fractured and overgrown, with wild grass creeping up through long-forgotten cracks like thin fingers reclaiming what the sky had once owned. The wind whispered through shattered glass panes, carrying with it faint echoes of propellers, static bursts of old radio chatter, and the long dormant pulse of engines that once filled these skies with life. Earl had served this tower for nearly 4 decades, guiding planes through storm and stillness, his voice steady and clear even when the world below shook with uncertainty. His work had been his sanctuary, his identity, and his legacy until the one flight he couldn't bring home. His son, Mark, had followed in his father's footsteps, not as a controller, but as a pilot. Mark's passion for flight burned hot and bright, fueled by the very stories Earl once whispered into his childhood dreams about the freedom of the open skies and the dance of machines that soared like birds untethered by gravity. But on that fateful winter night, the storm arrived quicker than any forecast had warned. Mark's small plane vanished from the radar. For hours, Earl sat in this very chair, clinging to every flicker on the scope, calling through the static, his voice trembling as each unanswered transmission carved deeper into his chest. And then, only silence. Mark's body was never recovered. Only scattered wreckage washed ashore days later, leaving nothing to hold, nothing to bury, nothing to speak to except the empty sky. The airfield closed within the year, its relevance fading with the newer airports built farther south, and Earl retired into the kind of isolation that doesn't announce itself, but slowly tightens like frost around the edges of the soul. He returned to the tower often, tending its slow decay not to preserve it, but because he simply could not let it disappear entirely, not while his son's final call still echoed within these walls. And then Luna came. The German shepherd appeared at dawn, her silhouette framed against the rising sun, standing near the entrance gate that hadn't turned in years, as though she belonged to the winds that roamed freely across these fields. Earl spotted her from the observation deck, his breath catching as her gaze lifted to meet his from far below. There was no urgency in her stance, only certainty, as if she had finally found her destination. For days, Luna returned, each morning resting by the tower's rusted doors, her patience stretching beyond human understanding, until one morning, Earl unlocked the gate. As she ascended the spiral stairs alongside him, her paws clicking gently against the iron steps, Earl felt a strange warmth enter his chest, not unlike hearing the first clear transmission after hours of static. He spoke aloud to her, words he hadn't dared speak to anyone in years, recounting the night, the storm, the helplessness that had never left him. Luna sat quietly, her breathing slow and steady, grounding his voice each time it threatened to falter. That afternoon, Earl noticed something strange, a faint red light blinking on the old backup console that had long been thought dead. Curious but cautious, he powered up the secondary system, its hum stuttering to life, accompanied by the soft crackle of an ancient tape reel unexpectedly activating itself. The recording began to play. It was Mark's voice, calm, clear, recorded during his final training flight weeks before the accident. "Tower, this is November 305. The air is smooth tonight. Feels like I'm flying beside you, Dad." Earl's knees buckled as the voice filled the tower, the years collapsing into a single moment where father and son briefly shared the same space once more. The recording continued, filled with casual check-ins, small jokes, and finally, "If something ever happens, Dad, I hope you know flying was never what scared me. It was leaving you behind." The weight in Earl's chest broke open, not a sharp pain, but as release, as River's long dam finally burst free. Days later, with help from a few retired pilots and townsfolk, Earl restored the tower's old radio system, not to guide planes, but to create a place where voices long silenced could finally speak again. He opened the Memory Frequency, a weekly broadcast where pilots, families, and loved ones from all over shared stories, final transmissions, unsent letters, giving their lost ones one last flight home through the open air. Each night, as static filled the background and voices poured through the airwaves like small lanterns floating into the sky, Earl sat beside Luna, his fingers lightly brushing her fur in quiet gratitude. And as the stars blinked overhead like tiny aircraft winking through distant clouds, Earl whispered into the darkness beside him, "Do you think she carries us where we cannot go, or brings them back where we still remain? I believe she walks the thread between what was lost and what's waiting to be found," whispered Lucas, his small voice breaking the hush that had settled over the empty lot in Willow Creek, where ashes and wildflowers now shared the ground like an uneasy truce between memory and time. The boy stood still, his hands tucked deep into the oversized sleeves of a faded sweatshirt, his dark hair hanging just above his uncertain eyes, while beside him, Luna sat as she had so many times before, silent, steady, a creature whose presence felt heavier than flesh and fur alone. The house that once stood here had burned to its foundation many years earlier, leaving only a crooked mailbox and a few blackened stones to mark where life had once lived, laughed, and loved. It was here that James Holloway, firefighter, husband, and Luna's first and only real home, had drawn his last breath, pulling a stranger from the flames even as the roof caved beneath him. It was here that Luna, just a young shepherd then, had dragged herself from the wreckage, her coat scorched, her paws torn, refusing to leave the spot where James had fallen, long after the fire trucks had gone and the news crews had packed away their cameras. Since that day, she had never truly stopped searching. Lucas didn't know that history. He only knew the foster homes, the shifting faces, the words whispered too quietly to be heard, the nights spent sitting at windowsills wondering why his parents had left without a note, a reason, or a goodbye. The Thompsons, his new adoptive parents, were kind people, patient in the way only those who have waited too long for a child can be, but kindness alone was not enough to bridge the wide, fragile distance between Lucas and the world. He didn't speak much, didn't smile either. And though the Thompsons had tried everything, books, counselors, long walks in the park, the boy remained a closed door with no key. Until Luna arrived. She had come to their front porch one gray morning, her golden coat dulled by time, her steps slow but certain, her eyes deep with a patience no person could ever teach. At first, Lucas watched her from the window, unsure, cautious, wondering if she would leave as so many others had before. But she didn't leave. She waited. It was Lucas who opened the door. It was Lucas who sat on the porch steps, silent and still, as Luna came forward, not with the wild enthusiasm of younger dogs, but with the deliberate calm of someone who understood that trust is never taken, it is only given. For days, they sat like that, boy and dog breathing in the same rhythm, sharing a silence that grew less heavy with each passing hour. And now they stood together at the edge of the place where her story had begun, and where, perhaps, it was meant to end. Lucas knelt slowly, his small hand reaching out to rest lightly on Luna's weathered head, feeling the slight tremble beneath her fur, the slow, labored breath that spoke of miles traveled and burdens carried far beyond her years. He didn't flinch when she pressed her muzzle against his chest, her body leaning into his with the full weight of everything she had been and done, a final gift of trust between two creatures who understood too much about being left behind. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long, gentle shadows across the scorched earth, Luna laid down at Lucas's feet, her body curling softly, her breathing slowing to a steady, peaceful rhythm. The Thompsons stood quietly a few paces behind, their hands intertwined, tears gathering but unfallen, understanding without needing to ask that some farewells do not need words to be real. Lucas leaned closer, his forehead resting against Luna's, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You're safe now. You don't have to keep walking." A few minutes later, with the last of the day's light brushing her coat in gold, Luna closed her eyes and took her final breath, not in fear, not in pain, but in the kind of peace reserved for those who have completed their journey with nothing left undone. The boy sat with her long after the sun dipped below the horizon, his hand never leaving her side, the world around them slipping into a hushed reverence that only endings can create. Later, as Lucas stood and turned toward the waiting Thompsons, the boy who had once spoken to no one found his voice again, soft but certain. "She found me." The Thompsons, tears slipping freely now, only nodded, understanding that there was nothing more to be said. Weeks later, a small, simple stone marked the spot where Luna had lain, no grand monument, no elaborate engraving, just her name and a single line beneath it. The one who carried the lost home. And somewhere, perhaps in the places between dreams and waking, between what is lost and what is found, Luna walks still, not searching, not waiting, but simply there, patient as ever, for those hearts still too heavy to carry themselves alone. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.